Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar organized by the International Institute for Research and Education, the IIRE in Amsterdam. The IIRE is a socialist education center. We organize meetings, both in person and online ones as these. We publish books, working papers, and other materials in order to be of aid and to help clarify debates on the contemporary radical and socialist left. So today's webinar is the first in a small series discussing the changing shapes of imperialism today. We will be looking at manifestations of imperialism in different parts of the world and consider what responses the radical left should formulate. So tomorrow we will have Pierre Rousset discussing the rise of China as an imperialist power. The day after that, Hanna Perkoda, Catherine Samari, and we hope also a socialist activist from Ukraine will discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the response of the left. And on Tuesday, Ilya Matveev will be discussing Russian imperialism. But today, as the first day in our series, we have Peter Drucker discussing the Marxist concept of imperialism and the role of the United States as an imperialist power. Peter Drucker is originally from the United States, but has been based now for many years already in the Netherlands. He's a socialist who has written a great many articles, many of them dealing with US imperialism and its impact. He is also a former co-director of the International Institute for Research and Education, an advisory editor of the US Socialist Journal Against the Current, and the author of Warped: Gay Normality and Queer Anti-Capitalism. So I will be chairing today's meeting. My name is Alex de Jong. I'm one of the two co-directors of the IIRE based in Amsterdam. The way we have organized today's meeting is that Peter will talk for approximately 45 minutes. And after that, there will be some time for questions and answers. You can ask your questions during the lecture using the Q&A button. We will make a selection of the questions that we will pose to Peter after his introduction. So in order not to spend any more time on introduction, I will now give the word to Peter. Peter, go ahead.
Thank you, Alex. It's an honor and a big challenge to be introducing this series of lectures on imperialism. Because it's a challenge to talk about imperialism at all today when imperialism looks somewhat different from it did a few months ago, specifically than it did before the 24th of February when Russia invaded Ukraine. There have been many debates, many issues raised, new lines drawn across the radical and revolutionary left. And I want to try to talk about what these changes have been and what the continuities have been with what we thought before the 24th of February. It's important to note that this is not the first time imperialism has drastically changed its shape in the world since Lenin wrote his book in 1916. Specifically, I would focus on three different earlier major changes in the history of imperialism. First, 1945, with the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War, which was a major change in the shape of imperialism. Second, from the mid-1980s, basically, with the rise of neoliberal globalization, which was another bigger change, culminating in the mid-1990s in what the economist Danny Roderick refers to as hyperglobalization, which was again, a slight change within that big change. And now again, we have this major change today. And each time, in each of these major changes, there were elements of continuity with the analysis Marxists had before of imperialism, and elements of rupture, big changes that had to be adjusted to and come to account with. And each time there were major political debates. During the First and Second World Wars about the position to be taken, under the Cold War in relation to wars of national liberation, with the rise of neoliberal globalization, the debates about the concept of empire as opposed to the concept of imperialism. And now, of course, there are major debates about what the war in Ukraine means, and parallel to that, what a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan means and what position should be taken about that, what it means to our position on sanctions, to arms aid, to NATO expansion. All these are things that have to be talked about. Luckily, I don't have in this introduction to address all these issues because the people who are giving the later three lectures, Pierre and Hannah and Katrin and Ilya, will all be addressing those issues. But I feel it's sort of up to me to lay some groundwork for the series as a whole. I'm not going to talk too much specifically about Chinese imperialism or Russian imperialism, though I will some, because those are the crucial changes now, is the prominent role of Russian and Chinese imperialism in our global analysis of imperialism today. I'm particularly glad that there will be a Russian comrade and I hope a Ukrainian comrade to talk about those issues, because we have learned a lot from Russian and Ukrainian comrades over the past few months in our way of looking at imperialism. But what I want to do basically today is look at some theoretical and historical basics and look at each of these previous phases of imperialism and try to sort out what in our previous analysis still applies and what doesn't still apply. And because the other three reports won't focus so much on US imperialism or the imperialism of the major European Union imperialist powers, I want to focus particularly on them to emphasize the continuities there. My key arguments, basically I have two key arguments. One is, by comparison with the Cold War period, particularly, or with the period of hyperglobalization, the period of imperialism we're in today is a period of heightened conflicts, heightened inter-imperialist conflicts particularly, greater instability, and yet, I would argue, at the same time, imperialism still needs to be viewed as a whole. That is to say, we have greater conflict between different imperialisms, US and EU and Japanese imperialism on the one hand, and on the other hand, Russian and Chinese imperialism particularly. And yet, all these different imperialisms are part of a coherent global neoliberal imperialist system. And that applies particularly to, I think, the way we need to look at Russian imperialism today and Chinese imperialism today. Politically, I think this kind of analysis is the best way of grounding an overall anti-campist politics. That is to say, a politics that opposes all forms of campism, a politics that acknowledges the reality of Russian and Chinese imperialism and intransigently opposes them, and at the same time remains intransigently opposed to US and EU and Japanese imperialism. So an anti-capitalist politics has to refuse to see any of these different imperialisms as a lesser evil in any sense. None of them is a lesser evil globally. Clearly, US imperialism plays a particularly prominent role globally still, but even regionally, I will argue, none of these imperialisms is a lesser evil. So if there are people who call themselves Marxist out there who maintain or tend to suggest that in Ukraine, for example, US or EU imperialism is a lesser evil today than Russian imperialism, that's also, I would say, a form of campism that we need to reject. In other words, what I'm trying to argue for, what I'm trying to lay the basis for, is a revolutionary politics that's independent of all these different imperialisms and therefore independent of the global imperialist system as a whole. So to make this case, I want to go back to basics. And that means going back to the period that was opened by the rise of imperialism in the late 19th century, and particularly the period of imperialism that was opened by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and continued until the end of the Second World War in 1945. And I would say, understanding the basics of a Marxist analysis of imperialism in this initial period means going back to Lenin. And this is without discounting the contributions made by other Marxists like Luxemburg, like Hilferding, like Bukharin, but to say that Lenin in particular drew several conclusions about imperialism that have stood the test of time and that still need to be recognized today. And I would say there are basically 5 of these lessons that Lenin drew about imperialism that still need to be upheld. First of all, Lenin understood imperialism as essentially an economic system. Of course, imperialism has military manifestations, has manifestations at the level of the state in all sorts of ways. But Lenin's contention was that to understand military imperialism, you have to basically trace it back to capitalism and to the economic dynamics of capitalism. That basically military imperialism and imperialist wars are a tool to safeguard the economic dominance of particular capitals, state-based capitals. Second of all, Lenin understood the heterogeneity of different imperialisms in the world. He had an understanding of capitalism, of imperialism, that placed a central emphasis on export of capital, capital investment, securing of markets, globally colonial empires. And yet he was obviously strongly opposed to Tsarist imperialism, and he understood the distinctiveness of Tsarist imperialism, Russian imperialism in his own period. He understood that the Russian Tsarist Empire had to be understood as an imperialist power, despite the fact that globally, economically, it was weak. That is to say, in normal economic competition on a global scale, Russian capital would never prevail over other capitalisms in the world because its level of productivity was on the whole lower. The total size of the Russian economy was on the whole smaller, and that made a difference. And that's an important lesson for today, because after a period of 75 years or so, in which Russia was subtracted, you could say, from capitalism on a global scale. Russia today is once again a capitalist country, once again part of the capitalist system, and yet, as an imperialist power, Russia is once again distinguished by its relative economic weakness. And that means that for Putin, as the chief of Russian imperialism today, military power, state prestige are key to Russian imperialism generally and to the economic power of Russian imperialism. Russian capital essentially only predominates in the world where the Russian state can secure its markets and its economic space. Outside the territory of Russia and the territory of the states that Russia dominates politically and militarily, Russian capital is weak. And that has obvious implications for Putin's motives in invading Ukraine on the 24th of February, and the very great stakes for Putin in winning this war. Because, as has been remarked, without Ukraine, Russia politically, militarily, as a state, doesn't amount to much in the world. And if Russia as a state doesn't amount to much in the world, then Russian imperialism doesn't amount to much in the world. So there's a lot at stake for Putin in that. And you can say something similar, not the same, but somewhat similar about China as an imperialist power. China is a very distinctive imperialist power because of the great role of the Chinese state and of the Chinese Communist Party in Chinese imperialism. And though it's important that those are a state and a communist party born of another anti-capitalist revolution in which the former state bureaucracy, together with the former overseas Chinese bourgeoisie, plays a key role. So that makes Chinese imperialism too different. And yet, despite the differences of these different imperialisms, it's important to understand that this does not make Russia or China any less imperialist today. They still have the forms of military and state expansionism underpinned by basic capitalist interests that Lenin defined as central to imperialism. And that's the case. Also, something they basically share in common with the imperialism of the key countries of the European Union, despite the fact that the European Union is, in a certain sense, the polar opposite of Russian imperialism. Whereas Russian imperialism is economically weak and militarily relatively strong, the European Union is economically strong and militarily it has feet of clay, as the saying goes. And yet, the European Union is also imperialist, if not a single imperialist power, a convergence of several key imperialisms, German, French, Italian. And this makes it important to uphold a third lesson that Lenin drew in his time in his analysis of imperialism, which is that established imperial powers, which have less need to expand militarily, are still just as imperialist and need to be understood as imperialist powers, even when they act defensively. His understanding, Lenin's understanding in the First World War, was that Britain and France, as established imperialist powers, were just as culpable as Germany, as an aggressively expanding imperialist power. And that was the same conclusion that Trotsky drew in the Second World War about Britain and France, that they were just as imperialist and just as culpable in the Second World War, in a sense. fourth lesson that Lenin drew was that the main dividing line in the world, despite the fact that he saw his time as a time of anti-imperialist wars, was that the key dividing line in the world was not between the different warring imperialist powers, but rather between the imperialist powers as a whole and the countries in the world dominated by imperialism, which he in his time called colonial and semi-colonial countries. He saw this as a lasting structural divide in the world based on ongoing relationships of economic subordination. And that had to do with imperialist powers' dominant market positions, with their privileged access to raw materials within their colonial empires, and so on. At the same time, Lenin saw this as mainly an economic divide and not primarily a juridical divide. That is to say, countries dominated by imperialism were not necessarily legally, formally colonies. And when Lenin looked at what he called semi-colonial countries, countries like China, like Persia, like Mexico, which were formally sovereign independent states, he saw them as on the same side of the divide as the formal colonies, countries dominated by imperialism. And that, I would say, is also an important lesson for our own time, still a lesson that holds true if you look at a country like Ukraine. And here I want to stress something about Ukraine that has not been stressed so much in all the debates about it, which is that in economic terms, Ukraine can still be seen today as a semi-colonial country. Specifically, if you look at the 2015 association agreement that Ukraine signed with the European Union following the victory of the Maidan Revolution, essentially, it puts Ukraine in the position of an economically colonized country. Ukraine is obliged to respect a whole number of economic regulations devised by the European Union, which Ukraine as a non-member has no say in drawing up, but nonetheless, many of them apply to Ukraine today. Ukraine has been obliged to open itself up to European Union exports, European Union investments. So in a sense, what Ukraine is doing in defending itself against Russian aggression is also defending the economic space of the European Union, or the economic space dominated by the European Union, against Russian aggression. So that, I think, is a significant point. And lastly, as a political point, as a fifth conclusion I want to stress from Lenin's analysis a century ago, is that Lenin believed that whenever independent resistance arose in a dominated country to imperialist domination, that resistance was progressive and worthy of support by Marxists, by anti-capitalists, by revolutionaries. And this was a key difference that Lenin had with a revolutionary anti-imperialist like Rosa Luxemburg, because Luxemburg believed that in the era of imperialism, the only genuine self-determination, the only genuine national independence had to be on the basis of revolutionary socialism. So when in 1916, the Easter Rebellion broke out in Ireland against British imperialism, Luxemburg's analysis was essentially that the rebellion could only be seen in the context of the imperialist world war that was raging at that time, whereas Lenin believed that the Irish Rebellion had to be seen as something independent and something worthy of support. And he even argued that that would be the case even if the Irish rebels had accepted military aid from German imperialism in their fight with British imperialism. Still, he said, the Irish Rebellion was a revolutionary act with potential for becoming part of an international socialist revolution. And that, I think, is a lesson, also a lesson to be applied today to the war that's going on in Ukraine now. Because, as in Ireland then, Ukraine is resisting an imperialist power, Russian imperialism, and it is resisting it without being an integral part of an inter-imperialist war. There are no NATO troops or US troops or European Union troops on Ukrainian soil. The direction of the war is in the hands of the Ukrainian government, which acts independently. And the fact that Ukraine accepts weapons from NATO, from the United States, from European countries, and is even dependent on those weapons to defend itself against Russian imperialism, doesn't change that essential progressive aspect of European resistance. So that, I would say, is a Leninist conclusion you can draw about the war in Ukraine today. So that's about the continuities between imperialism today and imperialism as existed in Lenin's and Trotsky's time. Moving to a later period, what are the continuities and the discontinuities with the later period? So looking at the period of Cold War imperialism, the period from 1945 to say 1991, that represented a break in a major sense with the earlier period, 1914 to 1945, in the sense that there were no inter-imperialist wars in that time. The major powers that opposed US imperialism, the world's only imperialist superpower, were the Soviet Union and China, which in that time were not capitalist powers. And yet, inter-imperialist rivalry was an ongoing reality of the Cold War period between the United States, European countries, and Japan. So there was a particular overall structure of imperialism in that period that still applies in many ways today to the relationships between the United States, the European Union, and Japan. That is, on the one hand, real economic rivalry, economic contradictions, even economic instability, and on the other hand, a central role for the United States militarily as the guarantor of the imperialist order as a whole. This is still the case today. If you look at US military spending on a world scale, it remains overwhelmingly the biggest source of military spending in the world. Today, still in 2022, 38% of the world total of military spending, which gives the United States military an ability to project power worldwide that no other country can remotely equal or challenge. And NATO has to be understood as one part of the US military world system. NATO was only a defensive alliance ever in the sense that it is defending the imperialist order worldwide. And it's always been important to understand NATO in that way. And it was important to understand NATO in that way even during the Cold War. in a period when NATO activities were mainly limited to the European theater, because NATO was not just an alliance of European countries against potential Russian aggression then, but also an alliance of most of the world's major imperialist powers, the US, Britain, France, Italy, all of which were colonial powers in that period. And Marxist opposition to their country's participation in NATO in that period was based on the understanding of NATO's role in the imperialist world system. And that's even more true today. It's even more relevant to the way we look at NATO today, because unlike in the Cold War period, NATO is far from limited to the European theater. NATO faced the choice, as the saying was, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, of going out of area or out of business. That is to say, projecting military power around the world far beyond Europe, or ceasing to be relevant and ceasing to exist. And that is in fact what happened. NATO as such has been a key player, for example, in the Afghanistan war, as long as the Afghanistan war was going on between 2001 and last year. And that role for NATO in Afghanistan has no parallel to the earlier period of NATO during the Cold War. NATO was not explicitly a player in the Vietnam War, for example, or a player in the Algerian War. Yet, in that period, anti-capitalists had no problem opposing NATO. And it's a bit paradoxical that there are Marxists today whose opposition to NATO seems to be not quite as strong as it was, despite the fact that NATO's role as an actor in the global imperialist system is much clearer today than it was in the Cold War years. And it's clear, for example, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO. It's been very visible with Sweden, in return for NATO membership, betraying Kurdish organizations who were based on its soil in response to pressure from Turkey. But that's the kind of deal that NATO has always involved. The interests of British and French imperialism were always, of course, integrally safeguarded by NATO, and it's still the case with different imperialist interests today. Another continuity with the Cold War years is the fact that the central role of the US militarily in the world pays economic dividends in a way that's actually very important for the US economy and the US political economy. This was visible during the Cold War, for example, in the mid-1980s, when the US had a serious problem with the weakness of the dollar, with the weakness of US exports, and Reagan was able to use the geopolitical role of the US to impose on other capitalist countries in the world a devaluation of the US dollar in a way that made it possible for US exports to recover and the US economic role in the world to improve. Something similar happened in 2003 with the US and British invasion of Iraq, when the US, and to a secondary degree Britain, used their geopolitical role and their military role to get rid of, to eliminate the interests that that France and Russia and China had built up in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime. So the US and Britain gained economically from their military role, and the US, even today, I would say, has advantages in Eastern Europe, has ties with Eastern European capitals and a position in Eastern European markets that would have not been possible in its, without its military and geopolitical strength. So the last period of imperialism I want to look at, by comparison with this new period of imperialism that's just opening up now, is the period of neoliberal globalization. We can ask, and we could have asked even before the 24th of February, are we still in the period of neoliberal globalization today? And to answer that question, I would say you have to make a distinction. You have to make a distinction between the period of neoliberal globalization that opened up with Thatcher's election, Reagan's election, the 1982 debt crisis, and the later period of what's been called hyperglobalization that emerged in the early and mid 1990s with the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, with the signature of NAFTA in 1993, and with the founding of the World Trade Organization in 1995. The period that opened up by 1995 was a period where multinational capital on a global scale was clearly dominant in every imperialist power. And the integration of Russia and China into a global imperialist system that happened during this period was based on an acceptance of that same dominance of multinational capital. You had what could be called in this period the Walmartization of global capitalism, where Chinese exports based on relatively cheap Chinese production, making China the workshop of the world, became central to the structure of capitalist markets in the United States, Europe, and Japan. This is the period of, and just to say, there was a whole series of mechanisms that secured the dominance of the imperialist powers in this same period. And Claudio Katz, in particular, did a good job, I think, of outlining those mechanisms. Forced indebtment, structural adjustment policies, forcing open markets, increased repatriation of multinational profits, all this leading to a new intensification of global inequality and reining in the political autonomy of dependent states. So this was important to understand. Contrary to the ideology of hyperglobalization at the time, which was, in Thomas Friedman's words, that the world is flat, or in the perspectives of Negri and Hart, that there was a global empire that was no longer the sphere of particular imperialisms. All that turned out to be nonsense, essentially. And all the illusions, most of the illusions in any event, about the rise of the BRICS, countries like Brazil and South Africa, to the same level as the rich capitalist countries, turned out not to be true. The world of hyperglobalization was a world of steep hierarchy, and that's still the case in the world, with Brazil and South Africa falling back economically, and even India, which had relatively rapid growth rates for many years, still having a GDP with India's billion population that's smaller than Germany's, with Germany's 85 million population. So this shows, I think, the reality of inequality in today's imperialist world order. And it's important to add, even today, China and Russia are still integrated into the global imperialist order. Walmart is still the world's biggest company, measured by revenue. Russia still has essentially an extractivist economy dependent on the exports of its oil and gas and timber to the rest of the capitalist world. Not to the same countries as before the 24th of February necessarily, but still the structure of the Russian economy has not fundamentally changed. And China is still a member in good standing of the World Trade Organization. But Russia and China are no longer integrated in the same way into the global imperialist order. And it's important to see that all imperialist countries' relation to the global order has shifted. You can say, okay, the Russia of Vladimir Putin is no longer the Russia of Boris Yeltsin. Its relationship to the world institutions and to the US, Europe, and Japan have changed. In the same sense, the China of Xi Jinping is no longer the China of Deng Xiaoping. It has a different, more rebellious, more nationalist relationship to the central institutions of global imperialism. But at the same time, it's important to say the United States doesn't have the same relationship to the global order as it did before. And Trump marked an important change, which Biden in many ways has continued. For example, the World Trade Organization appellate panels are still not functioning because Biden has still not taken the steps that would enable them to function. Biden has not rolled back the sanctions that were imposed during the Trump administration on China. The United States has still not joined the International Criminal Court and clearly has no plans to join the International Criminal Court. So all these structures of what is still ludicrously called the rules-based international order no longer function in the same way. And no imperialist power respects them or accepts subordination to them in the way that they seem to in a relatively brief period, say from 1995 to 2008. And all this is reflected in a shift in the political relationship of forces within each imperialist state, a shift in what Nikos Poulantzas called the power block, the relationship between different fractions of capital, the overwhelming dominance of multinational corporations and banks within each state's ruling class is no longer assured in the same way. And with Trump's rejection of a series of trade agreements, with Brexit, with a series of changes, you see the rise of more nationalist fractions of capital, I would argue, which have more power relatively than they did 10 or 15 years ago. This is reflected in the rise of the far right in country after country, but it's not limited to the rise of the far right because the traditional right, the center, even the center left, reflect interests of different sectors of capital than they reflected in an earlier period. And this is reflected globally and throughout societies in, for example, the rise of racism, which is a reality, hostility to migration, attempts to cut off the flow of migrants and refugees in the world, which is a major political and social reality. It's reflected in terms of gender and social relations, sexual relations, with the conflict, for example, between what Sarah Faris has called femo-nationalism and more traditional sexism, between homo-nationalism and heteronationalism, So we're in really a new period, a period of greater instability, greater conflict within capital, and all these things have major societal implications. The more specific consequences of these shifts in different parts of the world, I'll leave to the lecturers in the 3 other seminars. I just want to conclude with one general political point. And that is that today, as in Lenin's time, and now I'm sort of returning to the beginning and to the early period, as a century ago, Marxists need to be champions of self-determination. As a century ago, at the same time, our defense of self-determination needs to be informed by a clear understanding that no imperialist power can be counted on as an ally in the fight for self-determination. So it has specific implications for the war in Ukraine today. I would say it's understandable and justified that Ukrainians today want weapons from NATO to defend themselves. But as Gilbert Ashkar has pointed out, US and British imperialist schemes to use Ukraine to punish and constrain Russia, to roll back Russian imperialist power, are dangerous, obviously dangerous, given the fact that Russia is a nuclear power, and the risk of nuclear war is omnipresent in the current conflicts. And also from a Ukrainian point of view, futile, because as long as the Putin regime remains unshaken, there is no real prospect of a Ukrainian complete victory in the war, in the sense of rolling back all the Russian gains on the ground that were made since 2014. Putin could never, would never accept a Russian defeat on that scale as long as his regime remains in place and unshaken. And to understand that is to understand that reliance on NATO imperialism for a Ukrainian victory in this war is a mistake. That the only real prospect for Ukrainian self-determination and genuine independence has to come from international solidarity, and specifically from change within Russia, which has to mean solidarity with the Russian people. That's a long-term perspective, obviously, not something that's going to result in Putin's overthrow tomorrow by a revolutionary movement. But it has to be the perspective, because that's ultimately the only hope. And that means that the kinds of stupid nationalism that have been promoted in this war and manifest all over the place, boycotts of Russian ballet companies and athletes and so forth, sanctions that hurt ordinary Russians, are all totally counterproductive if you believe in independence and self-determination. So today, as a century ago, a consistent anti-imperialist politics, I would argue, has to be a politics of national liberation and an internationalist politics. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. So while you were speaking, we received a number of questions and comments. So I will start by asking you 3 of the questions that were raised, and then you can take your time to answer them, and we will see if we have time for more questions. So while Peter is answering, you might also want to enter new questions. So we will start with 3 questions. The first is from Joe Gray, who asks, how can it be said that Ukraine is acting independently when it relies on NATO arms and money, and NATO has its own interests in the war? So that's the first question. A second question for Peter is by Mark Bonhomme. How do you view subordinate nations like Catalonia, Scotland, and Quebec within imperialist countries? Do you see their national struggles as national liberation struggles against imperialism? And then the third and final question for this round is by David Finkel from the US, who writes, the United States power was dramatically weakened by its invasion and failure in Iraq and by Trump's incoherent policies. How much has Putin's invasion of Ukraine restored US imperialist quote-unquote leadership as the guarantee of European quote-unquote stability? So those are, to start with, 3 questions. Peter, what is your response?
Okay, the first question is just a disagreement. I think you can see very clearly how different Zelensky's position as president of Ukraine today was from the position of governments whose countries were integrally involved in global imperialist conflicts. If you look at Serbia and Belgium in 1914, or if you look in China after 1941, you can see that those governments, which were either governments completely in exile out of their own countries, or governments that retreated to very small portions of their national territory where they could barely maintain themselves, that meant that they had virtually no real freedom of maneuver. They were incapable of making decisions that were in open conflict to the desires of the major imperialist powers that were backing them. That's not true of Zelensky today. He can, the United States can give him weapons and say, we think you should use these weapons to attack this target in Russia, but not to attack this other target in Russia. But Zelensky doesn't necessarily have to respect those kinds of recommendations. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. And this is reflected, I think, in the whole way the Ukrainian economy functions. Because on the one hand, economically, Ukraine is very dependent on the European Union. On the other hand, Ukraine has its own structure inherited from the post-Soviet transition, in which oligarchs play a central role. And Zelensky was politically the creation of one particular oligarch, the one who sponsored his TV program, made him a star, and ultimately made him president. And Zelensky is constantly involved in a balancing act between his external backers, the US, the EU, NATO, and those internal Ukrainian interests on which he is also dependent, whose creature he essentially is in a different way. So this doesn't mean that Zelensky is in any sense a left figure. He never was, he still isn't. His attacks on labor and so forth are well known. But it doesn't mean that he's merely a puppet of US or NATO or EU imperialism, because he's clearly not, as you can see from his actions. Mark Bonham's question about Catalonia and Quebec is interesting to me. I would say that ultimately, potentially, because Quebec certainly, I would say, is an oppressed nation. It has a bourgeoisie, but a bourgeoisie that is subordinated in many ways to the English Canadian bourgeoisie and the Canadian state. And there is a potential there for struggles for genuine national independence to become struggles for full national liberation and therefore anti-capitalist struggles. But today, I would say that's only a remote potential, because that is not the orientation of any of the main actors in the Catalan or Quebec national movements today. In Catalonia, those main actors accept Catalonia's integration into the European Union and NATO, and therefore its subordination within imperialist structures. And in Quebec, the Quebec national movement, certainly the Quebec bourgeoisie, accepts Quebec's continued participation in whatever the successor to NAFTA is called, and in NATO as well. So in that sense, what the dominant nationalist forces in Catalonia and Quebec can offer to their peoples today is an extremely limited form of national autonomy, and one that does not in any fundamental way challenge the structures of imperialism. And that's too bad, and something that I think the anti-capitalist left should be doing its best to challenge. And I think the anti-capitalist left is doing that to the best of its ability. Finally, in response to David Finkel's question, I'm not really sure. It's a key question, and I'm not really sure of the answer. It is true that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a great help to the European Union and to NATO. It's a transformation that, for example, Germany, which a year ago was still very much dragging its feet about meeting its formal NATO target of 2% of GNP to be devoted to military spending, has turned around and is actively working to do that. The European Union, which was and is a fairly ramshackle, weak structure in many ways, but has, since the 24th of February, made big strides forward on various levels towards being a more unified imperialist structure in response to the war in Ukraine. So that's true, and that's bad news. That's not quite the same thing as saying that that the US as a global imperialist power has recouped all the loss of prestige and influence that it lost with its losses in Iraq and Afghanistan and under Trump. On a global scale, the support for the US role in Ukraine and in confronting Russia and China is nowhere as big outside Europe as it is in Europe. You look at India, you look at Africa, you look at Latin America. I don't think the Russian position or the Chinese position have weakened at all since the 24th of February. In all those parts of the world, there's still a deeply rooted reluctance, including in many capitalist classes, to choose sides with the US against Russia or against China. And even more striking is the reluctance of the Saudis and the Gulf states to accommodate the US and to supply the oil and gas that the US and Europe need to survive the Russian cuts. So it's a tentative answer, but tentatively, I would say, I don't see, I mean, you can say Putin did Biden a favor and did the European Union a favor, but so far, I don't see that Putin has done them such a big favor that they've recovered from the damage that Bush Jr. and Trump and even Biden have done. Tentatively, that's what I would say. That was it.
I think we have some time for a few more questions. It will not be possible to address all of the questions and points raised. It's of course a very wide subject that we also in the following days hope to deepen the discussion. But let's continue with two remarks or questions posed to Peter. First, a question / comment raised by Farouk Suleria, who writes, I hope the comparison made between the Irish uprising and Ukraine does not necessarily apply to such cases as, for example, the Taliban fighting the US occupation. So if you could say a little bit about the position towards such forces supposedly fighting US occupation, that would be interesting. Another point is raised by Wim Balterse, who asks about the position of US imperialism in, for example, Africa and Latin America. Can we say that in those regions of the world, there really is a case of a competition between imperialist powers? So those are two more questions. If you can respond, Peter. Okay. We will see how much time we will have left afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, I'll do my best. The Taliban question is a thorny question, I would say, from Farouk Suleria. Of course, even between Ireland and Ukraine, there's a difference. The Irish Republicans who rebelled in Ireland were clearly a left force, a left nationalist force, but definitely a left force, and their revolutionary potential was clear. And there's no comparison even there with Zelensky in Ukraine, who is in no sense in the left. That applies even more strongly, of course, to the Taliban in Afghanistan and to reactionary Islamic fundamentalism wherever it exists. I would never define the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or Daesh or any comparable forces as in any sense progressive. Having said that, I think it was still the responsibility of anti-imperialists to oppose the US and NATO war in Afghanistan. The essential tragedy of that war was that as long as the only real alternative to the Taliban was a government that was clearly a creature of US imperialism, there was no ultimate prospect of anything but a Taliban victory. And at any moment to say, withdraw the US troops was to say, let the Taliban win. It was the same as, for example, with the South Vietnamese government. After the US withdrew its troops in 1973, actually the South Vietnamese government did a little better because it survived for something like 2 years after the US troops withdrew. But a regime like that, like the imperialist-backed regime in Afghanistan, is always such a facade, such a Potemkin village, that that only direct imperialist intervention can save it, and that's a difference from Ukraine, of course, because Zelensky can survive without NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. That was never a real possibility in Afghanistan. At the same time, I think there was no point, from any progressive point of view, of pouring trillions of dollars into Afghanistan as part of imperialist efforts to block the Taliban. It was always doomed. That's a tragedy. And I think now progressives are in the terrible position of trying to rebuild a resistance on a progressive, feminist, democratic basis from virtually nothing. I don't know what else to say about that. Finally, in response to Wim Baltussen about anti-imperialist competition in Africa and Latin America, yes, I would say there is real anti-imperialist competition in Africa and Latin America. I think the position of the Russians and the Chinese in Africa and Latin America is sometimes exaggerated a bit, to the point of creating the impression that that there's a danger of French imperialism in Africa being completely pushed aside or marginalized or defeated. I don't think that's the case. The US and Europe still have positions of strength, economically and militarily, that are far from negligible. But the Chinese and the Russians have made gains. In Mali today, the French troops have withdrawn, not far, just as far as Niger across the border. And the Russian mercenaries have a stronger position. And China does have a base in Djibouti, alongside the other imperialist bases, of course, but it's there. Chinese backing has real advantages to African and Latin American states and capitalists as compared to the US and European powers. So all that competition is going on. It's real. It's by comparison with the kind of competition that existed between the US and the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War years. The competition that exists today is somewhat more pacific, I would say, less involving the danger so far of the outbreak of actual wars. But it exists and it's real. That's all I can think of to say about that.
Well, we still have some time left, and there are still a few more questions that were asked. So I think we can continue with a couple more. One is a question raised from Mindanao in the Philippines, whether you can say something on the relationship between the ecological question and imperialism. for example, how it expresses itself in terms of food production. And another point that has been raised about what is new today is that it seems that with Ukraine, the concept of inter-imperialist agreements about spheres of influence seems to have ended with the Russian invasion. Could you also speak to that? And a final question I would like to raise is concerning what you described as the military feet of clay of the European Union. And how do you see the possible evolution of EU imperialism in this regard? Because for the moment, it seems as if EU imperialism is content to remain under the NATO umbrella, but there have always also been forces arguing, of course, for an EU armed capacity. So if you could discuss that as well, then I will now give the word again to Peter.
Okay. Thank you for the question about ecology. That is a question that that underlines, I think, a couple of the points I was trying to make. One is about the reactionary character of all the contending imperialisms. The war in Ukraine is, of course, happening in the midst of a terrible intensification of the climate crisis. And it has raised the question of, very, very starkly, of renewable sources of energy as an alternative to oil and gas, particularly at a time when Russia is either cutting off access to its gas to Europe, or the European countries are doing something to reduce their dependence on Russian gas. And this was in a time when supposedly all these countries were trying to increase the share of renewable fuels in their energy mixes. But nothing of the kind is happening now. On the contrary, what we're seeing is big steps backwards at the worst possible time, turning again to coal, delaying or reversing the phasing out of nuclear power, and to the extent that that natural gas is still seen as an important energy source. There's just an effort to substitute Russian natural gas with some other natural gas in the Netherlands, to delay the end of natural gas production in the Netherlands. In the case of Italy, to make new deals with Algeria to import Algerian natural gas, all of which, of course, is going to have terrible effects for carbon emissions and global warming. It's just a sign that in ecological respects too, there is nothing progressive about any of the contending imperialist powers. These developments also underline what I said about the structural divide in the world. The essential structural divide is not between particular imperialist powers, but between the imperialist powers as a whole and the dependent countries, the countries dominated by imperialism, because the food crisis resulting from the drastic decline particularly in grain exports from Russia and Ukraine, is obviously having the worst devastating consequences for the countries in the world where food was already the biggest problem. And so we're seeing levels of hunger and even famine that totally reverse any of the so-called progress that had been made towards the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN for 2030, and the resources being poured into arms and war are resources that are not going to subsidizing or providing food to desperate people who desperately need it. So it's a sign of anti-social priorities, anti-human priorities of all the contending imperialist powers. Has the era of inter-imperialist agreements ended with the war in Ukraine? You can say that if the reference is specifically to agreements between Russia on the one hand and the US and the European Union on the other hand. But still, there are all sorts of other inter-imperialist agreements in the world. And deals are still being made between the US and Britain and France and Germany and Japan and China, reflecting different amounts of power. So I wouldn't be totally sweeping and say, now it's clear there'll never be an inter-imperialist agreement again. There will be, based on the shifting relations of powers. Finally, in response to Alex's own question about the feet of clay of EU military imperialism, there are, of course, as in everything, big disagreements within the European Union between different countries. France, in particular, at one extreme, is the most favorable to constructing some sort of autonomous European military force, and countries like the Netherlands or the Eastern European countries, most of them, are the countries that are most favorable of continuing military cooperation and military reliance on the United States. That said, there is a certain consensus that since the US pivot to Asia under Obama, and given the increased tensions in the world and the increased violence in the world with the war in Ukraine, that Europe needs to amount to something more militarily than it did before. So there is, across all the capitalist parties pretty much, support for rising military budgets and for European military structures that were already being built before this war, that are being built now somewhat more quickly. Nonetheless, there are fundamental military capacities that Europe just lacks, and that it has no prospects of acquiring anytime soon. To have a major military intervention outside Europe, in the event of a confrontation with China, for example, in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, or around Taiwan, the European countries are completely incapable of projecting military force through the air or over the seas in a way that the US is still capable of doing. And in that sense, the European countries have to continue to rely on NATO, have to continue to rely on the United States, because there are certain kinds of military operations that they just don't have the infrastructure for and aren't going to have the infrastructure for in the military, in the foreseeable future. And that means, well, that inter-imperialist agreements will continue to be struck between the US and the Europeans on all sorts of levels because of Europeans' fundamental military dependence in that sense. That was it.
I think that brings us to the end of today. So to the end of our first discussion on the changing shapes of imperialism. So just as a reminder, tomorrow at the same time, we will have a lecture by Pierre Rousset on the rise of China as an imperialist power. The day after that, Hanna Perkoda and Catherine Samari, and we hope also Ukrainian comrades, will speak on Ukraine and the task of the left posed by the Russian attack against Ukraine. And then Tuesday will be the final day in our series. And that will be with Ilya Matveev on Russian imperialism and the situation inside Russia today. So finally, I would like to say that if you're looking for more references and further reading, you can, of course, check out our website, IIRE.org, and we will also add some more references in the announcement of the lecture series. And on our website, you can also, of course, sign up for our email newsletter, and you will receive news on future events and publications. So finally, thank you, Peter, for an interesting contribution. And I hope we will see everyone again tomorrow at the same time. Bye.